Schönen guten Abend, sehr geehrter Herr Kruse.
Good evening, Bernd Scherer, ladies and gentlemen. When Bernd Scherer called me up before the summer to invite me to come and speak to you today, I accepted with great pleasure. It was an offer that was impossible to refuse. So once again, thank you very much for that. Now this evening, I'm not going to give you a nostalgic review looking back into the past. Far more, I want to set a few impulses for the big project that's coming up in the next 4 years in this house, but also in this city. Perhaps you'll allow me to begin with a little personal anecdote. When and how did I start being fascinated with time? Well, it began in 1973. My considerably younger self was going through a sudden transition in her life from a busy work life and a turbulent personal stage in my life. I transferred to calm, idyllic Cambridge to spend a sabbatical there. How is it, I asked myself, that some people have lots of time and some people have very little time? Why is it that some people can concentrate on one thing, whereas others are constantly juggling various different commitments, multitasking until the point of being overwhelmed? And I saw myself in both of these. Although I wasn't originally planning to do this, I started to engage quite seriously with time. Edmund Leach, a world-renowned anthropologist, was a provost at the King's College in Cambridge, which was my guest institution at the time. And generously, he gave me access to his private library. And so I read whatever I could on the subject of time. I found out quite quickly that there was an International Society for the Study of Time that had recently been founded, and they were planning to hold a conference in July of that year in Japan. Thus, I decided to travel to the Lake Yamanaka at the foot of Mount Fuji, and living within my means at that time meant taking the Siberian Railway and then an East German freighter that took passengers from Vladivostok to Japan. I borrowed the typewriter of the captain, and on it I entered the last few corrections to my lecture about the relationship between structures of time and measuring time on a social level. And the fascination has held me for a long time. At the conference, I met various different disciplinary accesses and met some very interesting people. I later was actually elected president of the International Society for the Study of Time. My young daughter at the time liked these strange interests of her mother's and asked me clever questions such as, what is time? And is time the same everywhere? But it was 2 islands of time, a month in 1987 and one in 1988, that made it possible for me to write the book Eigenzeit, which translates as in one's own time. So there was no hurry. There was no publishing house pushing me to meet a deadline. There wasn't even a publishing house. So the book had time to grow and to interweave the academic and personal strands of time. Today, I would like to come a bit closer to now, the present day, with 3 questions. Firstly, what has happened to the Eigenzeit of those days, and which other more pressing questions are in the foreground? Secondly, what has changed in the way we perceive time, and what has developed from the longing for the present moment, the desire to have more time for oneself? And thirdly, Bernd Scherer referred to this already, what impact does the change in categories of past, present, and future with which we live today have? So in response to the first question, what significant developments have taken place since the book Eigenzeit? What continues to be an issue and to concern people is the pace, the acceleration with which modern life and their own existence take place. Most of us have essentially had this sense that the world is moving at a speed that exceeds our biological, cognitive, neurological, and psychic boundaries, which generates stress and concerns us. You can either respond to this with fearful defensiveness or the opposite to compensate for it, a sort of going with the flow, with the ephemeral now paradoxically appearing to be the only thing that we can hold on to in a now that seems obsolete and without orientation. Bernd Scherer also, in his introduction, referred to the acceleration of natural processes of growth with which the technologies of modernity and the creation of a new reality get going. The phenomenon of acceleration is undeniably one of the most serious side effects and consequences of the technosphere, which has transformed our reality and which is the subject of the next project of the Haus der Kultur in der Welt. 2 books published recently address this issue. Hartmut Rosa distinguishes in Beschleunigung und Entfremdung, or acceleration and alienation, between technological, social, and cultural acceleration. In some cases, these processes are conditional upon one another. In some cases, they are a contradiction in terms. Technological acceleration is something that's tangible. You can measure it. You can assess it. Social acceleration shows the changes in a society and often goes hand in hand with the loss of stability of institutions. Creating new institutions takes time. A third feature is cultural acceleration, how quickly we live our lives. The paradox of increasing time pressure despite all the time-saving technology is something we're all aware of, i.e., technological and social acceleration is something that Judy Weichmann is also interested in. Technologies are aimed at making our lives easier by accelerating processes and efficiency, but instead of giving us more time, our time is increasingly compacted and scarce. In her book, Pressed for Time, she positions the increasing acceleration in digital capitalism. She notes that the process of technological innovation always contains a number of different options. She shows just how different people come to terms with the digital technologies in different ways. At the end of the day, we are the ones who shape our social reality. I would agree with this diagnosis, but I believe that both authors are excluding one phenomenon that I would like to address in Eigenzeit Revisited, which is perhaps the first response to one of my questions. This is an ice flow that is crashing down. The phenomenon is well known, and the image stands as a representative for thousands of others, from the clearing of the rainforest to a loss of biodiversity, from the rise in drought disasters to extreme weather situations in our latitudes as well, from increasingly scarce water supplies and food supply problems up to the challenges that accelerated growth of megacities entails. And all of these phenomena are ones that are subject to acceleration processes, which have brought human beings into an apparently irrevocable collision course with our natural environment. Will it be possible in this race against time, quite literally, to prevent the collapse facing us? Will we manage to access new sources of energy in time? Will we manage to provide sufficient water and food for a global population which is exploding faster than was expected? And can the cultural evolution be accelerated by science and technology to the extent that life will be worth living for everyone on the planet, or will even more be destroyed in the process? Unlike biological natural evolution, which unfolds in long sections of time and therefore has a lot of time for trial and error, cultural evolution is taking place at a speed of knots. We are the ones that undertake the selection process. We are the ones who cause the equivalent of mutations. And these are intentional. They're not by chance. We are the ones who are constantly manipulating and intervening. But what do we know about the unintended consequences of anthropogenic activity? It is no longer just the familiar time scale of human history that will decide this competition, but rather the confrontation with time scales on a totally different level. This is the first major change that I would like to refer to in Eigenzeit Revisited. A second change, which is perhaps at least as significant and will certainly have consequences, is acceleration in terms of the growth of available data. And more, the capacities are increasing to store this data, to process this data, and to reuse this data. Doubtlessly, today's world is very much defined by big data. Digitization and computerization have created worldwide network services. They are used by the states, by intelligence services, by the financial world, criminals, science, academia, industry, all of us. Deus ex machina that we know from history has been succeeded by a new Deus in machina. These are the algorithms which process data with unbelievable speed and connect this data. The speed exceeds human perception. We can only register the impact. Normal users are therefore not so much concerned by the speed, but the fact that all of the data that's ever been collected, entered, and stored is retrievable whenever you like and can be reused. The storage is something that takes place forever, for eternity, or for what's left of eternity. Privacy increasingly transpires is an illusion. And while there are legal battles about the right to forget in the internet, the latest information and communication technology can do so many different things, and the things that we end up allowing it to do with us are things that entrench themselves deeply into our experience of time. And this leads us to the second question. What sort of things have changed in terms of our perception of time and our sense of time? What's happened with the longing for the present moment? We're seeing the progressive individualization of our experience of time and its fragmentation into smaller standardized units. And this experience leads inevitably to a short-term perspective, almost a short-time perspective. The shorter the units of time, the more they can be repeated with small variations. They can be broken off and picked up again. They can be combined with one another as fragmented time patterns. We use these short-time combinations in order to exchange information with others. And what information are we exchanging with others primarily? Well, information about everything and about nothing at once, about banal events in daily life, as well as about important geopolitical news, our own sensitivities, and everything that seems to be necessary for coordinating social coexistence. But Claude Shannon, whom we owe the theory of information transmission to, maintained that the content of the transition is irrelevant for the actual information transition. His definition, perhaps I can remind you, of information only covers the number of bits that are necessary for the transmission of the state of the system. So what does big data do with time and with our feeling for time? We have become part of the international data and transition network services. All data-compatible traces we leave behind are being absorbed, and there are many of these. The little tiny things from everyday life, the countless social interactions that connect us with other people every day, the tracks, the traces that our reading habits, our listening habits leave behind, our consumer behavior, the steps that we take from A to B, and the way we change places, what means of transport we use to get from A to B, etc., etc. And what do we get from big data in return? We get targeted, tailored information, tailored just to our personal profile about what? About everything and nothing, about everything that's perhaps supposedly good for us and what we should do about it. It is a wide range of things that we are offered with. Buy this book, buy this device, these designer shoes, go on holiday here or there, do this for your health, and if you exercise, do it this way so that you'll get better, because this way you can increase your performance. Big data indiscriminately absorbs the past. That means that the more tracks and trails there are, the more data, the better. The content is irrelevant. The question of why, the motivation, is one that is replaced by the question of what, because that is what generates data, data that can be reused for other purposes, other questions, in other contexts. Thus, data that seems insignificant to begin with can be lent meaning and significance. The meaning of predictive and analytics is on the basis of the analysis of our behavior in the past, that is, the trails and traces that we've left behind us, to predict our present behavior and the near future. Big data levels the past out. Important events become a data point under millions of others. Completely other patterns emerge. And that means that these service providers that send the information back have a personalized promise for the future. It's hardly surprising then that this flood of information competes with the news, with messages, with promises, and they're all competing for our attention. Attention, and this has been said regularly, has become an economically scarce commodity. Operators of network services do a great deal in order to allow this scarce commodity to work for them as profitably as possible. But we, the users, also have the problem. To whom and what should we give or sell our attention? Thus, this longing for the present moment grows in a new, unexpected way into an everyday life penetrated by ICT. Some respond to this through mindfulness. This is Tanya Singer, an excellent neuroscientist who practices mindfulness herself, but also examines it from neuroscientific perspectives. Now, focusing consciously on ourselves, on our breath, on our thoughts or lack of thoughts, mindfulness is sort of an awareness oriented on the present. In our everyday lives, it is a break that we take, a stopping time for a moment, for a limited amount of time, briefly finding our way into immersing ourselves into a different perception of time. And this is one of the reasons why music makes it possible for us to immerse ourselves into another time. Music demands mindfulness. It knows breaks. In some pieces by Johann Sebastian Bach, the breaks are longer than the notes played before the break. But longing for the present moment isn't something that can be satisfied entirely just by practicing mindfulness or listening to Bach sonatas. It's too entrenched in our existence for that. The biological time arrow points relentlessly forward. Mindlessness tries to squeeze moments that are outside of the time regime from it, even if we know that it will be, this arrow of time will catch us up in the end. But like so often, and like so much in the history of humanity, technology elbows its way in between. It doesn't just change our relationships to the environment, to other people, but also our relationship to ourselves. It changes our experience of time. Thus, in a period in which there are huge growths in the amount of electronic data quantities and the range, as well as density of the network services, we're seeing a new technologically based service being offered to us that's emerging to satisfy this longing for the present moment. The technological components for this are the countless apps and the algorithms that create these connections from which media-based Eigenzeit, time for oneself, as it were, flows. They are standardized, personalized to you, based on your preferences, just for you, for your lifestyle, for your wishes, filtered for you. They are everywhere. And you just have to look at your iPhone or your smartphone and you can see that they can be accessed from everywhere. Media-based Eigenzeit, time for oneself, is both only there for ourselves, but at the same time connecting us with other people, and that's what makes it so attractive. It would seem as if this longing for the present moment, this desire to have time for ourselves, this wish for Eigenzeit that I described in the final chapter of my book nearly 30 years ago, seems to have been fulfilled in a very unexpected way. Technology gives us a sense of having control over it. A digital switch, a key with the on-off option seems to be enough. We're controlling the moment in the knowledge that the next moment is already waiting to be switched on. We're keen on everything that media-based time for ourselves, Eigenzeit, can offer us: information about the world, about friends, even if they're only Facebook friends. Increasingly, however, they offer information about ourselves. There are countless apps at the moment that will offer you the opportunity to observe yourself in real time. Biological markers and physical symptoms can be measured, can be compared with others, or can be compared with ourselves from yesterday. And you can also set your performance goals for the self you want to be tomorrow. We're seeing textile, wearable electronics penetrating the market. And this allows us to expand media-based Eigenzeit even further. It covers the whole body 24/7. These invisible selfies of our life functions are what these new biomarkers are. They show the biotemporal fluctuations of our inner physical rhythms, and this data is also transmitted, converging with other data in order to be reused. Thus, every individual is linked with every other, and at the same time feels like a unique individual. Because this uniqueness generated in this fashion only makes sense, can only really be created if there's a reference framework for it, which is composed of the uniqueness of all the others. And this is one of the reasons why media-based Eigenzeit fits seamlessly into the sharing economy. But it doesn't just yield something for the operators of the network services and the startups of the latest apps. It also yields something for the user. But sometimes when we are afraid of further acceleration, afraid of losing control, afraid of not being able to fulfill the goals we've set ourselves, media-based Eigenzeit comforts us with the communicative gift of the moment. You are not alone, it tells us. Despite the countless variations that media-based Eigenzeit offers, it is not something that can last. Everyday life continues. The biological arrow of time points relentlessly forward. Even in the moments that we spend with media-based Eigenzeit, even though that can actually constitute quite a lot of time of everyday life, they are part, or rather they're not a considerable amount of our day, but they are part of the time that we live our lives, our Lebenszeit. They are inextricably linked with our Lebenszeit, which covers all human lives, the unexpected vicissitudes. Lifetime is comprised of growth and decay, the time that we spend with our families, as one generation makes way for the next, illness and then death. It becomes even more difficult to combine Eigenzeit and lifetime or Lebenszeit as time goes on. The acceleration with which the destruction of the natural environment is taking place through processes of anthropogenic activity shows how difficult it is to fit human Lebenszeit into larger timescales. Our institutions are hardly equipped to counter the increasing time pressure and the expectation that you can be reached at all times. And they're not created to offer spaces to think, time to reflect, institutional free spaces to test out new ideas and to undertake experiments within a framework. And I really wish the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, the House of World Culture, that it become an island of exactly this. The time of institutions follows a different rhythm. Our institutions that we have today were created as responses to problems of a past era. In view of the necessary adaptation to changing conditions, synchronization between Eigenzeit of institutions and the Lebenszeit, or lifetime of human beings, has come unveiled. Here we are in 1930. John Maynard Keynes is holding a lecture in the student club at the University of Madrid on the subject of the economic future of our grandchildren. Most of his predictions about economic growth and increasing prosperity that cover an entire century have indeed come about. One of his predictions, however, leaves us somewhat perplexed. Keynes forecast that the average working day in 2030 would comprise just 3 hours. Automation is increasing at a speed of knots. The jobs of the middle class are already affected on this. We're still not in 2013, but the urgent question of the social distribution of labor has not been solved. One of the main theories of my book Eigenzeit, was the acceleration of academic technological innovation activity and how it was closely linked to the synchronicity as a phenomenon of perceiving time. But this didn't lead to social synchronicity. Global asynchronicity generates new inequalities, as we see in the case of the refugee crisis. The connection between asynchronicity and inequality has taken on a new qualitative dimension. Scientific technical innovation is the main driver behind the quality of time. But perhaps the impacts are even greater when it comes for the time sections that mark the past, the present, and the future. These keep shifting because they haven't got universally valid categories. Within the end of the faith in progress and the teleology of modernization progressing in a linear manner, the category of the future loses a great deal of its attractivity. A present targeted to innovation, obsessed, if you like, with innovation, appropriates this future. William Gibson, a well-known sci-fi author, once said laconically, "The future is already here. It's just unequally distributed." It is being absorbed by the present, which selects and filters the enormous option for creating the potential of scientific and technology in order to create a space for reality, because the transformation of ideas into products and processes that can assert themselves on the market can only happen in the present. The future is not disappearing, but it has a different importance. Its inherent uncertainty emerges more strongly. We are increasingly beginning to understand that we are part of complex systems, and the graph that you're seeing here shows you an image of the complexity of these systems. Their dynamism is hard to predict because it is generated by unpredictable connections of individual components of the system. Once again, we are drastically reminded of how little we can predict the unintended consequences of anthropogenic activity, not to speak of controlling it. This brings me to my third question. What impact does the present that has been stretched through innovation have in terms of our experience of the past and the future? What do these changed categories of time do with us? What resources, and Bernd Scher has referred to this already, get lost in the process? Which do we gain in the process? The media-based Eigenzeit, as I've already emphasized, favors a short-term, short-time perspective. The past shrinks, it becomes flattened out, and it becomes presentified or brought to mind. One example is a linguistic analysis of the reports of the World Bank. Dominique Pestre and Franco Moretti looked at the language of these reports from 1946 to 2012. They saw an increase in management discourse and the use of the word governance. And we're seeing an increase in main sort of nouns that show a greater level of abstraction. And there's a frequency of temporal adverbs that you can see, like now, soon, later. Between 1946 and 2005, these temporal adverbs rather have declined by more than 50%. And the decline of these temporal adverbs, the author imagine, show a drastic weakening of a sense of time in the reports of the World Bank. The past, whether it's long ago or just a few decades ago, is losing its depth of focus and its otherness. One could talk about the grating of a sharp contouring that emphasizes difference. These are getting lost. The bringing in of the past into a stretched present shows another effect as well. Things that happened a long time ago become incorporated in the present, called to mind and presentified, if you like. The digitization of the past brings enormous didactical opportunities with it. Through changing cultural forms, new access is opened and other things are buried. Thus, visitors of Pompeii or Stonehenge can log in digitally. In Berlin, you can log in digitally to wherever you like. You can take part in the early inhabitants of our planet without ever having been there. You can take part in reconstructed rituals without ever having been to this place. But the more the form of depiction is like what we know and what we're used to, the faster the distinctions flatten out. The past stops being another country with other sensitivities and other structures. So perhaps what we're seeing here is the loss of an important resource, the knowledge that it could have been different. But there may be new potential gains that might balance out this loss, because the more our past, which is very much defined by human history, becomes part of the present, the more the distant past moves closer to us, entering our field of vision with scientific precision. The knowledge of paleogenomics and the methods available to us today are rewriting the history of evolution of our species completely. New relationships are emerging between us and the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. We're starting to discover that the current Amazonas area was presumably settled by people who came from the Australian archipelago at a time when this was much closer and the sea level was much lower. Thousands of years suddenly appeared to be as if they were only yesterday. And this is true to an even greater degree when we look at space. This is also becoming part of the present. The impressive images from Pluto that we received here on Earth in July from Pluto make us familiar with an extraterrestrial object which is thousands of light years in the past and yet seems so close to us and so present to us as if it were the moon. Space is increasingly developing into a vanishing point in which the long past of the entire universe and the direct future of humanity seem to converge in the now, the stretched present. The future visions of the 50s with their funny flying cars and other fanciful forecasts are over. Instead, we have driverless cars and drones that are just waiting until the market sends the right signals to enter on a mission. Robotics has made real progress, and progress with artificial intelligence is starting to even disconcert those who were directly involved in its development. Some believe that the fast-paced technical and scientific developments are linked with a loss of the future. My response to that is a decided no. Instead of the loss of the future, what we have is 100 years of now. 100 years of now is a beautiful, very apt slogan. It sends out a very strong signal. The short-term, short-time perspective should be replaced or countered by a long-term perspective. 100 years of now is a stretched present. It brings us closer to other timescales and demands that we integrate these in our activities today and in our individual and institutional timescales. Arjun Appadurai described the future as a cultural fact. He reminds us of the millions of people who, in India, for the very first time, have recently been able to develop wishes and desires. He talks about the capacity to aspire. And perhaps this is true for us as well in the apparently so saturated West. Our ideas and our capacity to shape the future through our wishes suffers under technological restriction. The flood of new technological apps and gadgets and toys that saturate our technological imagination again and again, generating new curiosity, squeezes out the capacity to aspire, namely the way we imagine another society, a good society. We haven't got any sound responses everyone would agree to the questions of the ancient Greeks for eudaimonia, the good life that we and our children aspire to. We still haven't learned that science and technology can only unfold their potential in co-evolution with society. We still haven't taken on board that new and global challenges demand institutions tailored to these challenges. Here as well, more imagination and political will to social innovation is required. The changes show us something else, though, that the future is radically open, but this openness has a price. The future is always inherently uncertain, an uncertainty that invites us to engage with its cunning. And this brings me to the Cunning of Uncertainty, my new book. I hope I have been able to entertain you and take you along this journey.